Hello, and welcome to our panel, Investor Interest in Climate-Related Risk Assessments and Built Assets. I am Noelle Brisson, your moderator, and today, to discuss this topic, we have gathered an asset manager, a technology enabler, and an expert in performance measurement. Three major roles in closing the trust gap that investors often feel engaging climate risk and what companies are doing about it. So it's a lot to unpack in this short session. Before letting my three colleagues introduce themselves, by way of background, I am a fellow of the RSCS, a member of its Americas board with a focus on data and technology, and I am a founder of CyberReady, a company that helps clients manage their cyber risks in real estate, and a recovering valuer, underwriter, lender, and investor. I'm based in the US, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with offices in Dallas, Texas, and in Paris, France. Friends, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours, starting with Alexandra, and then Richard, and then Emmanuel.
Thank you, Noelle. It is a pleasure to be on this panel with you, Richard and Emmanuel. Good afternoon or good morning to all. I'm Alexandra Faciu, and I have qualified as a chartered surveyor in 2001. I am based in Montreal, and I am an asset manager. During the session, I will share my experience on the subject on climate-related risks as an advisor to institutional investors and also as a member of the Americas World Regional Board, where I have taken on two very important passion projects. The first one to attract the next gen to our industry, and the second one to offer support to the RICS sustainability initiatives in North America. So about me, I have spent my entire career in international real estate, with the past 10 years in leadership roles in investment management, focused mainly on creating value at asset level, optimizing operations, and rationalizing portfolios. I have had the opportunity to work in 3 countries, in Romania, UK, and Canada, but I have been responsible for projects on all continents, except for Africa, so that's hopefully something in my future. I'm trained in Europe, so sustainability has always been part of my DNA. I was fortunate to get the opportunity to do asset management with the Quebec-based Impact Fund between 2011 and 2014. That experience has opened my eyes to the state of sustainability in North America and the leadership of Quebec in this space. So that's when I started the journey on sustainable asset management, even if that journey was rather slow, at the slow pace until very recently. So that's about me.
Thank you, Alexandra. Richard.
Thanks, Noelle, and hi, everyone. So just really quickly then, I'm Richard. I'm a partner in climate change and sustainability services for EY based in the UK. My main areas of focus over the last 13 years have been in terms of climate change, ESG reporting and assurance and biodiversity. And these are topics that I'll touch on in a few minutes in the discussion. So that's me really quickly, and I'll pass on to Emmanuel.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this panel. I'm Emmanuel Blanchet, co-founder and CEO of Deepki. Deepki is a #1 software in Europe to help real estate players, I would say, achieving a net zero pathway. We are helping them in collecting the data, providing some insight and reporting for regulation or voluntary frameworks purposes, and then design and monitor net zero pathway for real estate. As a background, I'm working in the climate change and carbon accounting for 15 years. And that was the purpose of founding Deepki, to help the real estate players in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So we have structured our discussion around 3 pillars: mitigation and performance measurement, valuation and underwriting, and last but not least, in our space, compliance. So, Richard, I'm going to let you open the discussion and tell us what you've been doing about measuring this performance.
Mm-hmm. Very many thanks for that, Noelle. So I'll just spend a few minutes then with some sort of global context on what we've seen at EY. So, you know, firstly, just to sort of set the scene, you know, in terms of climate change, there's a great deal of activity. We've seen action accelerating in recent years. You know, most of the large national economies have made net zero commitments, as have many of the larger corporates. There are many significant initiatives such as TCFD, and you know, as a result, many companies have now started assessing and reporting on their climate risks and performance. So a lot of activity, but notwithstanding all of the initiatives and progress to date, you know, at the moment, it's not been sufficient. So, you know, there is an emissions gap. The climate scientists are clear. It's essential we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees in order to avoid the worst effects from climate change. So, urgent need then to accelerate action on tackling climate change and decarbonisation. And as you know, a recent reminder, very recently, the latest World Economic Forum annual risk report has just come out, and according to that analysis, for an immediate timescale over the next 2 years, 2 of the top 4 risks to the global economy are climate-related risks. When the time frame extends to 10 years, the top 3 risks are all climate-related. And at EY, we undertake regular analysis globally on climate change and sustainability. And as some context from our recent research, from our latest EY Global Climate Risk Barometer report published last year, you know, we analysed around 1,500 large companies' disclosures from almost 50 countries all around the world. Key findings there included that the companies scoring best on their climate disclosures, on reporting how they're tackling climate change, included many European companies, also Japanese and South Korean companies. Canadian companies did very well last year. And you know, there have been important drivers such as regulation that have helped accelerate progress in these markets in the last few years. You know, for example, in my own sort of country in the UK, since April of last year, over 1,300 of the largest companies and financial institutions have had to disclose climate-related financial information on a mandatory basis, in line with the TCFD recommendations. And the bar's going up still further with full mandatory climate-related financial disclosure requirements coming into force across the UK economy by 2025. So that's the UK. More broadly, all G7 countries have agreed to make TCFD aligned climate-related financial reporting mandatory. Going back to our report, other key findings, around half the respondents globally had started using climate scenario analyses to understand their exposure to climate risks. We found plenty of good analyses, but overall, more to be done in terms of considering climate risks and also opportunities holistically. More to be done in moving beyond sort of a theoretical analysis of climate risk to embedding the findings from the risk and scenario analyses in a company's financial management, risk management, and strategy setting. And this will become increasingly feasible as the data improves, which it is. So, you know, there's been quite some progress recently, but need for further improvement. The bar is going up, more regulation is coming, and the data and resources are improving. So that's just sort of a quick summary on that point. Noelle, I don't know if you had any questions, or if not, we can maybe
Thank you, Richard.
Emmanuel.
Well, we're going to pivot to Emmanuel and tell us at Deepki, what are your measurement challenges and what risks do you see in buildings, and how people are, is there a progress in people's awareness?
Yes, thank you. And I insist on what Richard mentioned about the performance, which is clearly because the first step is to reduce the CO2 emissions. There's no question on that. And to reduce it, it's now a question of performance on each asset. And then we will talk about later, but it will be a question of valuation and compliance, because now we have thresholds. We know what is a green building, which is new actually. But then we have this need of performance, and to do so, you're right. We need to collect data. We need to have a clear and clean data, and to be sure that we have the 100% coverage on the building. Because if we want to talk about performance, of course, we need to have a comprehensive overview of the full consumption of the building, which is not so easy. And when you talk about challenge. But then it's also a good news for the market that it's now not a question anymore to compare the asset, to compare between your peers. You need to have the same methodology and the same level of data completeness. Otherwise, it will be only a question of discussion around figures. So yes, performance is a key issue. And now I totally agree. We didn't do so much before, but now it will be more and more professional. And it won't be a question anymore. That's a good news. But
that's
then
progress, yeah.
But then when we are talking about climate-related risk, yes, there is performance. They call also transition risk, but we have also mitigation risk, or an issue regarding the adaptation, because even if we reduce our CO2 emission, we now know for sure that there will be a climate change. The question is to limit, to reduce as much as possible this climate change. But yes, in 10 to 20 years, the climate won't be the same. We will have more heat waves in Europe, for example, but same in the US. We will have issue regarding fires. We will have issue regarding other climate-related risk, which we can call that physical climate-related risk. And regarding the assets, because buildings are clearly real assets, we need also to invest to be sure that the asset and the typologies are adapted to the future climates. And heat wave is a good example and very comprehensive one. If in a city, an offices will face twice or maybe more heat waves, is the usage of this building will be still possible regarding the technological inside the building. So that's a question for investors, because at the end, if you can't use your building, it will be clearly a question of valuation. You won't be able to rent it or to sell it. So maybe that was your question, but in terms of climate-related risk, yes, we have performance, and then it is clearly the first step. We also need to think about adaptation and maybe investment regarding mitigation of some physical risks.
Yes, well, a lot to do. And we saw it in Hong Kong with all the rain, a year ago, and in California right now, it's really pretty disastrous. I'm getting back to you, Richard. Is there anything missing for real estate when it comes to sustainability? And is decarbonization enough?
Yeah, so well, two quick comments then. First, to build on what Emmanuel just said, and I think it's important to sort of think in the context here, because clearly decarbonization is obviously essential, but I think it's really important where possible. We should aim higher than just reducing emissions. Aiming for a net positive climate impact. And already we see some initiatives and companies that are targeting sort of climate positive solutions. I'm sure this will become a lot more mainstream going forward. And for me, that's important because we know that a large proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions that we've emitted will stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, over sort of decades through the sort of century timeframes. And so, for these and for other reasons, we know that we've already sort of locked in future warming. And as you've just been sort of alluding to, we've seen how in the last few years global warming is already has been leading to more extreme events, climate-related disasters, and the coming years are set to be warmer. So there is a legacy problem, in addition to sort of the need to reduce emission. There's a legacy problem with carbon pollution already in the atmosphere that we need to address. So I think that's one point to sort of to bear in mind. The second one, and I mentioned the World Economic Forum annual risk report earlier. That also reminds us that although tackling climate change is absolutely essential, it isn't the only issue that we need to deal with. There are other, for example, environmental issues that we're faced with, other severe crises, such as in terms of biodiversity loss. The latest WBEF report rates biodiversity loss as number 4 over the next 10 years to the global economy. So, we don't have the luxury of just sort of thinking about climate change. We need to sort of tackle these other pressing issues simultaneously. And we have to remember that we're facing, complex, systemic, interconnected issues, such as between sort of climate change and biodiversity. Many of the solutions to tackling climate change are linked to biodiversity, nature-based solutions. There's no pathway to net zero that isn't also nature positive. So we need to do both. Nature loss is already sort of a clear risk, material risk to many sectors. In the supply chain, it would be to I would say all sectors really. But it's just in terms of biodiversity, up until now, companies really haven't had much information in terms of understanding their nature-related impacts, risks, opportunities. But a lot's happening. That's set to change later this year. The TNFD framework is due to be published. That sort of leverages a lot from the TCFD framework for climate, and that's going to be a detailed risk management and disclosure framework that will help organizations to understand, report, and act on their nature-related risks and opportunities, with the ultimate goal of helping to sort of push action and the flows of finance to nature-positive outcome.
Thank you, Richard. And Alexandra, take us back to North American investors, and how does this climate risk integrate in their overall risk assessment?
Look, every time I'm on a panel with colleagues from Europe, I'm reminded that we're still behind, behind other regions of the world. However, there's been a lot of progress done in North America as well, and the pension funds are leading the industry in integrating climate risk in their overall risk assessment frameworks. And then they're followed by the investment managers, right? And it's not surprising because most of the investment managers have pension clients as lead investors. Most investors here in North America, and maybe in Europe and other parts of the world as well, are developing their own in-house approach, to assess risk, climate risk, based on available sector-specific guidance and compliance requirements. So they are taking all that into account, depending where their portfolios are located. But even so, the integration of these tools to assess risks in their underwriting, asset management, and valuation can be particularly cumbersome. You have to remember that in Europe, sustainability has always been around in one form or another. So each new element has been organically integrated in risk assessment and, conversation, day-to-day life, asset management, everything. In North America, because climate change has become a thing only recently, and because social issues were not quite as important, or they're not spoken about as much until the pandemic, most investors here were all of a sudden flooded with too many new risks to manage on top of their traditional risks that they already had to manage. All of us on the panel and speakers and participants as well understand that sustainability is very broad as a subject and is still developing. I'm sure that most of us are aware, if we look at the risks that affect real estate investment, about 1/3 now are climate-related or transition risks, which is quite significant considering that until 6-7 years ago, they had scarcely been identified. I mean, if I think about it, those really LEED and GRESB, that were the two measures that help investors do something about sustainability until the pandemic. And now, the tide has changed, and basically everybody's drinking sustainability from the hose, so to speak. It's I'm being very, I don't know, very realistic about what is happening. Yet, investors, they do have to integrate all these risks into their underwriting process, and they have to do it in a sustainable fashion. One way that I like, that I've seen, and I also advise clients to do, is to integrate their risk, according to each investor's mission, vision, and values. Of course, there's an urgency, right, to integrate all these risks and take them into account. But I find that it's a lot better to have something than nothing, and sort of go into places and feel that most investors are clueless about it, which is a comment I had very recently from someone. So that's the state a bit of what is happening in North America. But investors are getting there slowly but surely, and I think it will accelerate in the coming months and years.
And how are tenants reacting?
Well, actually, I find that the tenants are driving all this, right? Because most of these tenants, they have their own targets and ambitions, and they're all, global citizens. They want to have an impact, and they have their own missions. So I find that it helped a lot, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in Europe. Maybe Richard and Emmanuel can comment about this, but here we see a lot of these very advanced, net zero buildings that have been developed by tenants, right? And I'm thinking in particular, I think Google has developed a new asset in the States, right? That is carbon neutral. So we have to think the tenants in a way that they are pushing investors to the, on the right path, basically.
And how about valuers? Are they on board? Do they have access to the data, or because that's probably a big challenge for them? So, from a valuer point of view, tell us.
The thing is, that valuation, we always look backwards, right? And then not backwards. It's a portrait in time, right? The value. And we're always looking at evidence. And unfortunately, so far, the difficulty has been, it's not that the valuers do not want to take that into account. For sure, we all do. We're responsible and asset managers, for sure. But without any, explicit evidence that these matters, have an impact on the values, it's very difficult to actually have a position on it. I think this subject is still is sort of developing, right? There's so many initiatives around the world around reporting and trying to quantify, climate-related risks and ESG and everything else that we're talking about it. But the reality is, there's really not an optimal, generally accepted framework to assess all these issues. And there are quite a few, right? It's not like, we're not talking about 3, we're talking about 10 to 15 elements, ESG and climate risk elements that need to be taken into account. And, when you look at the transactions, you will see the physical issues that come with it. You'll probably have some transition risk that you'll be able to understand, but in terms of other, elements such as social elements, they will be quite difficult to assess. However, I do have a solution for that, and that's the solution that I personally use. RICS is our governing professional body, right? At least for most of us, and it's a great source for best practices. they have published the last edition of Sustainability and ESG in Commercial Property Valuation and Strategic Advice. It's a very long title, but that's what it is, about 12 months ago. And it's a guidance note, it's not a standard, but it's providing a practical framework for valuation. You know, that's the one that I personally use at this point in time, because it provides explicit guidance for most, if not each, of these sustainability characteristics and risks.
Well, that's definitely a very good resource for our attendees. You mentioned Google and in your previously, and that really makes me think about Class B and C buildings, and so then that must be even more difficult to collect data and information. So I'd like to have your position on that, and then of course Emmanuel. So what do we do with Class B and C buildings in their way to obsolescence, and how do we measure, and do owners have the capacity to respond to and measure the performance of their buildings, no matter how atrocious it could be? But do they measure it, and do you see a difference?
So I'm going to actually let Emmanuel talk about measuring and how because his software solution is actually quite compelling, to help asset managers in doing their work. So I'm going to let him speak about it. But from my perspective as an asset manager, we're looking at practical solutions, right? We want to bring these buildings, B and C buildings to, and in some jurisdictions we actually have to, in New York, we'll have, investors will have to reduce their emissions, I think it's by 50% by next year, by 2024, and then they need to be zero by, I don't know, 2030 or something like that. I don't remember exactly. So from my perspective, they're just, the Class B and C buildings, they're just work in progress, and we need to figure it out sooner rather than later. And then Emmanuel can help us,
Yes.
a bit with
Work in progress. How do you handle that?
No, thank you, Alexandra. I'm not sure that the challenge is really on the measurement for Class B and C buildings. We can measure it, and the way we are working with real estate players is clearly that we, as much as possible, we are using existing data. The purpose is not to put IoT everywhere, and then only the Class A building have the I would say the opportunity to set up such complicated hardwares. It's clearly we need to start with existing data, and there is in every building because we have contracts, we have meters, so that's possible even if it's a Class B and C. But the question really is more on the impact on the valuation, and sometimes the possibility for Class B and C building simply to invest at the right level to comply to a net zero pathway. Because of course, if you are in the center of a big city, the rent will be okay to absorb those capex. But then if you are a Class B and C, some of them, it will be clearly an issue. Is it really possible in the BP, if we talk about financial issues, is it really possible to comply to this net zero pathway? And I'm sure that for some Class C building, the question is not so easy, and maybe it will be a real issue, and then maybe an obvious financial risk. Because if your Class C building can't comply to a net zero pathway, and the net zero pathway is becoming compulsory in certain region of this world, it's clearly a financial risk, and a huge one. So I'm not worried about the measurement, but more about the valuation. Maybe one point about the valuation, or a quick one, is like Alexandra said, it's not a question anymore, I would say. Yes, there is and will be impact on the valuation regarding ESG issue, and just the performance is a good example. If you have, I would say, a worst or one of the worst building, and then a bad performing building, yes, it will be difficult to rent it or to sell it. So of course there will be impact on the valuation. But the question is a quantification. That's a really good question. How could we include ESG KPIs or indicators to be sure that we are quantifying this impact on the valuation?
And speaking of financial risk, what is the impact, Emmanuel, of brown discounting or green premia, and what have you seen?
That's a really a good question, and Alexandra said that the valuators didn't take yet. I would say yet into account. It will be soon the case, but
Another
then there
work
is
in progress.
it's a work in progress, but the work is progressing quite fast. You will see this year a lot of white paper or discussion or maybe roundtable and panels around this question, and I'm sure that all the evaluators have that in mind because it's clearly on everybody's mind. What is the impact? Do I invest before selling my asset? Or so that's clearly a good question. We tried first approach, and we published, I think it's beginning of this year, a white paper on that. For example, we just take into account the capex necessary to comply to a net zero pathway in 2030. That's the first step. So I just take into account the capex to be sure that I either I need to invest before selling the asset to maintain the price, or it will be maybe a negotiation regarding the amount of investment needed to be sure that I can put my building compliant with this net zero pathway. So there will be a lot of discussion and question. Just one point, it's not anymore ESG KPIs, I would say, because when we talk about a good example in Europe, and we will talk about compliance in a few minutes, but
yes, because
Europe has decided to be net zero, so it means that your buildings in 30 years will be net zero. It's not a question of ESG or climate change belief, or it's just the fact that if you want to be a real estate player in Europe, you have to comply to this net zero pathway. It's not a question, a maybe. So of course, there will be a valuation issue.
So with all those, all your points, sounds like greenwashing is also now kind of a thing of the past, but it's still a real problem for investors. And so I'm going to ask the three of you, how do you detect greenwashing, and do you see it disappearing a little bit or diminishing? Quickly before we get into compliance. Who wants to go first?
I can go first.
I would say have the floor, and then we'll go to.
Yeah, I will be quick. I would say diminishing. We can't say that it's not possible anymore. That's still possible. And regarding, for example, carbon accounting, it's not only a greenwashing issue. It's just we don't have a common methodology around the world to calculate the carbon emissions. So you want to be market-based, location-based, you want to be net zero because you are buying some renewable electricity. That's still possible. So that's still possible. But it's diminishing, and in few years, it won't be possible anymore.
Alexandra, and then Richard, quickly on detecting greenwashing and chasing it.
Look, I'm actually going to let Richard answer this because he has, I mean, in North America, there's more greenwashing than in Europe. We have to be realistic about that at this point in time, but I think it will be diminishing because at the end of the day, investors want to, they need to invest in good products, bottom line, and it doesn't matter how you dress it. You just need to have the fundamentals there. So,
and maybe that's where, the many frameworks that are floating around, that might be a way, because you might get away with greenwashing on one framework, but not on the other. Would that help, Richard?
Thanks. Yeah. So let me just quick comment on the greenwashing point, and then let's talk about sort of compliance. But look, I think in terms of greenwashing, from what I've seen, I think we have to remember that the whole area of sustainability is still sort of rapidly evolving. There's a direction of travel towards more reporting, mandatory assurance, and so on. But that's where things are heading, and we're not there at the moment. So basically, I think there have been lots of cases of companies putting things in the public domain which led to a backlash under accusations of greenwashing, when it was quite companies venturing into areas that they weren't sort of expert in. let's say, yeah, sort of companies sort of reporting on the first time on climate change or in another area around ESG. I think that's been a big part of it, and there's a lot of skepticism sort of in terms of what businesses are doing, sort of in the broader public. There's been sort of identification of lots of different types of greenwashing. There are lots of terms out there now: green hushing, green crowding, not just greenwashing. There's a bit of a spectrum there, but I think what it's getting at is it's because it's an evolving area, and really to sort of reduce that, and I think it will reduce, but it requires a combination of sort of increased scrutiny internally. So there's a role for internal audit and for the board at companies, but also externally from external auditors and regulators. And then finally, a need for like a code of practice in terms of being clear as to the sort of the definitions, what constitutes greenwashing, and so on. And in the UK, one of the regulators, the CMA, launched a green claims code last year, and recently announced that they would be launching first official investigation against companies' ESG claims, and any companies that were sort of not in line with the code could face fines and penalties. So yeah, that's sort of where things are heading, I would say.
So that's good. Yeah, compliance, will probably in scrutiny will take care of it. Hopefully not over the years, but over the few years ahead. So Richard, let's continue on this compliance issue. Is there a convergence in terms of, or standardization emerging of all those frameworks and compliance requirements, and then what's next?
Great. Yeah. So let me be quick then, just with some with a quick summary. So I think first of all, sort of good to sort of as context to say that yes, there are a lot of different ESG standards out there, but nevertheless, most companies have been reporting under just a few at a global level. For example, GRI standards and SASB are very frequently used as sustainability standards. Both provide a wide range of topics the companies can report on, and then in addition to those sort of general standards, there are then sort of topic specific ESG standards or frameworks, such as in terms of the TCFD recommendations that focus on climate change. So yes, there are some different standards and frameworks, but I would say we often see that they've been developed for sort of for different needs, for specific audiences or purposes in mind. So for example, SASB and TCFD were developed primarily with investors in mind, and we see many companies reporting using more than one standard or framework. So there can be good complementarity between them. But then more recently, over the last couple of years, there have been some really significant initiatives that have come through that are helping to sort of drive more standardization. So for example, in 2021, the IFRS Foundation established the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and the goal of that is to develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. Last year, the first two draft standards were released. One was like a general standard, the other was on climate change. But they leveraged what was already out there in terms of existing leading practice. For example, the climate standard builds on TCFD, and there's a clear aspiration to sort of drive harmonization. And in the ISSB working group, there are representatives from the EU, the UK, the US, China, Japan. So that's been a significant initiative. Closer to home, or sort of more in terms of the EU, the CSRD is being implemented. That's going to impact almost 50,000 large companies within the next couple of years. That builds on the GRI and TCFD recommendations. So again, an example of towards harmonization. So I think it's positive that increasingly when a company prepares its ESG data for one purpose, it will have the information, the data that can then be used as the basis to report for other purposes. So yes, plenty of recent examples of convergence and standardization. That's great. That can help companies simplify their reporting. That can help reader understandability. That can help readers benchmark a company's performance and impacts. So there is that trend, but I think we can also see a few examples of divergence. So it's not all one way. So one example would be in terms of materiality. In the EU, the CSRD has taken an approach to materiality, which sort of basically looks two ways: the societal materiality perspective, the business's impacts on society, but also the other way around. Whilst with the ISSB in the US, it's the enterprise materiality perspective, looking at the impact just from one direction in terms of on the business. So divergence a bit on materiality. So that's one comment, and one last comment would be, although we see a trend towards standardization, we also see a trend towards raising the bar still further. And I mentioned briefly biodiversity. Up until now, very few companies have been reporting on biodiversity. They haven't had much data. There hasn't been much guidance on the reporting. That's set to change with some significant initiatives coming out in the near future, e.g. later this year, we'll have the TNFD framework. That's going to provide detailed guidance on how to report on nature-related risks and opportunities, impacts and dependencies. So that's an example of sort of, moving into new areas. One last example would be, TCFD. When that came out, the idea of sort of reporting on climate risks and scenario analyses was quite new. So I think basically what we see is, yes, we see a move towards convergence and towards a sort of a globally aligned ESG reporting landscape, but perhaps unsurprisingly also with some some important differences.
Thank you, Richard. Emmanuel, just to keep this compliance, more and these reporting requirements more granular, how does technology help, and where are the resources, and how do you deal with data privacy and security?
On your first point, actually, yes, we help the real estate players to gather all their ESG data and at the end to have some outputs for different reporting. So the purpose is not to answer and to be reactive to any reporting. It's more to control the ESG data and then to clean them, and then to be able to provide ESG data for regulation purpose, but also for voluntary initiative like GRESB or others. So yes, the purpose of your question is about technology, but to control those data is clearly to avoid a waste of time and time-consuming challenges regarding all these different frameworks and initiatives. You're totally right. Even if you're right, Richard, there will be less and less, and I'm really count on the compliance or the regulation. In Europe, for example, the European regulation will be really strong, and then so strong that a lot of initiative won't be useful anymore. We are talking about green building. Before, green building was green because you have a lot of certification, BREEAM, LEED, plus HQE, plus I don't know. And then the purpose is just to be aligned with the taxonomy. So maybe it will be also easier and simple. Regarding the data privacy, it's clearly an important issue, because the more ESG will be included in the real estate processes and valuation, and the more sensitive will be those data. So of course, all those data need to be secure, confidential, and private, even internally regarding the different stakeholders. You don't want, for example, that some of the property managers access to data on other buildings that they don't have in terms of property management. So of course, but on that, there is a lot of standards ISO 27001, for example, is a cybersecurity standard that we have. And then we apply all the standards to be sure that the data are secure and the data are actually private.
Okay, actually, just before we close, because we need to conclude this conversation, we had a question coming through asking if there is a central resource that would list the governance guidelines for ESG. So where would you direct, that attendee on that question? And by the way, all the unanswered questions will be collected by the RCS staff and dispatched to the relevant panelists. So if we don't get to the all the questions, that's how.
So just a few minutes on the first question, maybe.
Yeah. A central resource. What kind of central resource can people access to list all those governance guidelines?
It exists region by region. For example, for Europe, you have a central resource directly into the European Commission site web. For the US, same. You have on the government site, you have all the ESG regulation, not initiatives or voluntary initiatives, but regulation state by state. So it will be region by region. I'm not sure that it exists at a global level.
So I actually have a suggestion for that, because again, I'm going to go back to the RICS's guidance note on valuation. They do have at the end of that report, they have all the the major governing bodies and initiatives and so forth. So that's a good starting point. And the other one to go on the respective countries' governments' websites, province or whatever it is.
Let me just comment really quickly because I'm conscious of time on that. I mean, for me, I would say, we've been saying there are lots of different standards out there, but actually most companies are only using a few. So, I would say, we direction travel towards convergence. So, if someone looks at sort of the GRI standards or the SASB standards, or in terms of climate change, sort of the TCFD recommendations, that gives sort of a good starting point. We've always, for any company, any company should sort of look at what's sort of important, relevant material to that business. And so it's likely there will be additional things based on where a company's based, its sector, in terms of additional regulations at the national level, sector level. Yeah, so that needs to be taken into consideration as well. But, essentially, most companies are still, having a direct or indirect reference to one of those few main sort of sustainability standards that are followed by most companies globally.
All right. Well, thank you, Alexandra, Richard, and Emmanuel, for your insights and your comments. And as I said, the unanswered questions will be collected by the RCS staff. And to all our attendees, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the forum.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.